A good Erev Shabbos. Everyone knows the proverb, all good things must come to an end. We use it often. It may or may not come from Chaucer, maybe someone else. The question is, how often do we think of the opposite? Think about it. The corollary to this well-known proverb must also be true. All bad things must also come to an end. 100 years ago, there was a pandemic. Eventually, it came to an end. World wars have eventually come to an end. There's ample evidence that bad things come to an end. And this past week, some bad things did. Tisha B'Av ended the period of the 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, we mourned the loss of the temples and the loss of Jewish sovereignty over Israel, as well as countless tragedies that happened throughout history. We mourned, we cried, we ached, we grieved. We recounted awful chapters in our national life: destruction of the first temple, destruction of the second temple, profaning of our most sacred spot on earth, the Temple Mount in Yerushalayim, Har Tzion, and then the plowing under of it by conquering troops and our exile from it, the fall of Beitar, the massacres in the Rhineland during the Crusades, burning the Talmud in Paris in the Middle Ages, the Spanish expulsion, the Holocaust in Europe, a litany of suffering we went through on Tisha B'Av that stretches across 3 millennia. We still remember and we still mourn. And then after we remembered all that awful history, we practiced and modeled for ourselves something very important. We got up and we got on with our lives. We got on with this Shabbos, the Shabbos of comfort, Vaeschanan Nachamu it's called, after the first words of the Haftorah. We demonstrated to ourselves with our actions that we must mourn and grieve. That's an important part of life, not to be ignored or swept under the carpet. And that also there's a time when we have to get up. We have to move on, look ahead. We don't allow ourselves to get stuck in the misery of victimhood. Perhaps it's that ability, that gift, that talent and skill we've been practicing and exercising and reinforcing by doing it over and over again every year for thousands of years, that ability to mourn and cry and then get up after all that, maybe that's a comfort in itself. God promises us through the words of the prophet that it will be a comfort for us, and it will continue to be so until all sufferings, all misery, all persecutions remain only in memory. Words matter very much, and actions even more so. There's a story in Medrash on Shir HaShirim. It's quoted in Rabbeinu Bachai in Kad HaKemach for this Shabbos. It tells of a Babylonian king, Merodach Baladan, who was an idolater in keeping with the times. This was the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, King Hezekiah, First Temple era. So this Babylonian king came through a series of events to recognize the greatness of God, our God, the Jewish God. And he took the trouble to write a letter to the Jewish king praising the God of the Jews. He wrote in his letter, Shalom to Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah the king, Shalom to your great God, and Shalom to Yerushalayim. And he gave it to a messenger to send it off. You know how it is. Just when the mailbox closes, right, and your envelope drops into the mailbox, that's when you get the perfect inspiration for what you should have written in your letter. Well, this guy was no different. Just at the moment that he handed it over, it suddenly occurred to him that he had been not completely respectful in his view, in mentioning the king before his God. So this Babylonian king gets up off his throne and he takes 3 steps forward to the messenger and he stretches out his hand and he says, I'd like the letter back, I'd like to edit it. So he takes the letter, he changes his wording, and instead he writes, Shalom to the great God of Chizkiyahu. Shalom to Chizkiyahu, the king, and Shalom to Yerushalayim. So the Midrash explains that God acknowledged what he had done and promised a great reward. Those 3 little steps that he took to honor HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God rewarded him with 3 descendants who became mighty rulers of great empires. Such nachas. The lesson for us, though, is that even seemingly small things do matter. The prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu Hanavi, opens the 40th chapter of his Sefer with the words, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Be comforted, my people. Yomar Elekechem. Your God will say to the prophets. This chapter of Nachamu, this section, is always our Haftorah for the Shabbat right after Tisha B'Av, which gives this Shabbos its name. First, why two Nachamus? Why two comforts? Many say it's comfort for the first temple, comfort for the second temple. Makes sense. He's a prophet after all. Gvul Binyamin writes that one comfort is the comfort we'll have from Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah. Another comfort is that we'll have in the Messianic times. Yalkut Shimoni suggests comfort for the upper worlds, comfort for the lower worlds, comfort for the living, and those in the world of truth. Eicha Rabbah, the Midrash on Lamentations, on Eicha, which we heard read so beautifully, so movingly on Wednesday night, explains that it's a double suffering for God, so there's going to be a double consolation when things are corrected. Double suffering for God, what's that about? One is that there were sins that were committed, that's bad enough, and number two, that when Hashem sees that it's us who are the sinners, Mele, someone on earth did a sin. That's par for the course. It's a story of humankind from the beginning, by all accounts. But that the Jews should be the ones sinning, of all people to know better, how much that must pain God, so to speak. So there's two comforts for that. So then it's also noteworthy that the prophet uses the expression, Yomar Elokeichem. In the future tense, God will say. When will God say it? Now and in the future also, in the era of redemption. The prophet continues to say, speak words to the heart of Yerushalayim. Dabru al lev Yerushalayim. Speak directly to the heart, because the Jews are not easily taken in by superficial words of comfort, someone who's paying lip service, going through the motions. They're nice, but they don't reach the mark. The words of consolation have to come from the heart in order to enter into the heart, as we know very well from the Gemara and Brachas. A few verses later, he says that the grass dies, the grass withers, but the word of our God stands forever. God promises our redemption, and that promise will be fulfilled. Part of being human is not knowing exactly when it's going to be, and wanting to know. If we just know it's going to be next week, or even next year, or even 5 years from now, we could make it. But when it seems to stretch out endlessly forever, with no light at the end of the tunnel, it's a little hard to endure. Even seems impossible. Can we imagine a time? Can we even imagine such a thing, picture such a thing in our minds? A time without war and hatred, without oppression or racism. Can we even imagine going back to February, before COVID-19, when compared to now, we didn't have a care in the world in those days? Now it seems there's problems everywhere you turn. How, from this vantage point, can we even imagine a messianic era with universally recognized Jewish sovereignty over Yerushalayim? Not even a dream now, but a promise for the future. Machne Yisrael challenges us to stretch our imaginations a little bit. Who ever thought that Avraham and Sarah would have a son in their old age? Who would have believed that Yaakov, Jacob, this pauper, who crossed the Jordan River with only his walking stick in his hand, would one day become a man of great wealth? Who would have dreamed, pardon the expression, that Joseph, who was despised by his brothers and sold into slavery, would very soon wind up to be viceroy of all Egypt, and eventually come to be the rescuer of those very same brothers who sold him into captivity? Who would have imagined baby Moshe, cast into the Nile River as an infant, would be rescued and would grow up in Pharaoh's palace and one day lead the Jewish people out of slavery in Egypt and to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah? Each one of those seems impossible on the face of it, and yet each one eventually happened. So look at the situation of the Jews in the world now, the Midrash challenges us, and imagine that one day the Jewish people's standing in the world will be restored. The kingdom of David will be reestablished, and the temple of Jerusalem will be rebuilt, and all the exiles from around the world gathered in. And what's more, there will be peace and tranquility among nations, including Israel. Stranger things have happened. We keep the ability to envision that in particular this time of year, when we acknowledge the loss and we turn with hope towards the future. That's what's foremost in our minds. I saw a story from last year of a young Jewish guy backpacking through Europe who winds up, of all places, in Sarajevo on this Shabbos Nachamu. He can't find a shul, he doesn't know anyone there, can't speak the language. What's he going to do? So he puts on his Friday night clothes, a white shirt, dark pants, and a yarmulke, and he heads off to explore the city. So as he's walking down a main street, a man sees him go by, catches sight of him, and motions for him to come down. Come sit down here, sit down here. He buys him a beer, and he explains to him how happy he was to see someone in a yarmulke walking down the streets in Sarajevo, because that's the way it always was. Of course, the man was Jewish, And he was so happy to meet another Jew, he had to buy him a beer and connect with him. And through this combination of broken languages and sign language, probably the language of the neshama. How could it be that someone walking down Marshal Tito Street in Sarajevo wearing a white shirt and a yarmulke on Shabbos Nachamu, how could it be that he would meet another Jew and hear memories and stories of a community he never knew in a language he didn't know he understood? Rashi on this week's Parsha quotes another Navi, the prophet Tzfanya, to say, Ki az epoich el amim safa berura. He says, then I shall change the nations to speak in a clear language, likra kulam b'shem Hashem, that they can all call out in the name of God. That's Rashi's comment on the passage of Shema Yisrael, which is in this week's Sedra, which we say every day of our lives, morning and night. One day everything will be clear to us. Someone will explain to us in a language we didn't know we understood. Hopefully there will be a nice cold beer involved also. It wouldn't hurt. The world has not yet undergone that transformation. We haven't yet reached the appreciation, the level that everyone can call out in the name of the one God, maker of heaven and earth. But if a Babylonian king can recognize it, if an old Jew in Sarajevo can recognize it, then surely we can listen to ourselves, what we ourselves are saying 2 times every day when we proclaim God's oneness and sovereignty over the whole of creation. And we recognize and we express our heartfelt hope, the hope of centuries, millennia, that better days are coming. As we begin our march now toward the beginning of a new year, there are just 7 Shabbosim between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. As we look forward to coming back together in our beloved shul very soon, as we look forward to preparing ourselves for a new year, we take comfort from this Shabbos, a double portion, maybe even a triple portion, whatever it takes, in knowing that bad things do come to an end. Hopefully soon we'll have a complete handle on the pandemic, not just us, but in Israel and the whole world over, and all the other things that ail us, whether they be viruses that affect our bodies, or viral attacks on our good citizenship and our menschlichkeit and our common humanity that have also attacked us and spread and infected many people's hearts and souls. Or just the loneliness of being apart, separate from one another for so long. We know that soon, hopefully soon enough, all these will vanish and be replaced by goodwill and understanding, good health, kindness, safety, and decency, and one day peace. And we know that it's up to us, not to anyone else, to lead the way. Shabbat Shalom.